Okay. I'm speaking in English. I understand there is translation. Where is the lady of the translation? It's inside there. Thank you very much for your effort. I will try to speak slowly. Okay. Thank you very much for having me here. It's a great pleasure and it's an honor. And I am introducing my book that has been translated to Portuguese. And I wrote the book because I ended up in the parliament, in the Italian parliament. I'm not a politician. I am an entrepreneur. I started working on the internet back in the late 80s in Italy, and I made the first Italian ISP, and I have been the chairman of the Italian ISPs Association. And then our former Prime Minister, Mario Monti, asked me to run in his newly founded party to lend a hand. And I said, okay, yes. And that brought me to the parliament. When I arrived to the parliament, I started an intergroup, so a group across all parties related to technological innovation. And I discovered that many of my colleagues, almost all of my colleagues, did not have a clue about how technology is really impacting society and the economy. And I tried to write something that was simple, but that ties together all concepts and gives a positive view of the future. So telling what the problems that we are facing, what the problems are, but also not being too dramatic about these problems. I tried to give overall an optimistic view of the future. And I wrote this book having in mind decision makers, people who must take decision. It has sold very well in Italy, and now I'm very happy that it has been, I'm very grateful that it has been translated into Portuguese. It's a very beautiful piece of work. So, the first thing about my book is that I don't like the word virtual. You often hear about the internet as a virtual world. And a world means that it's a separate thing than our world. And this is not true. And virtual comes from the Latin virtualis, that has a meaning of potential, that is not real, that is potential. And this is also not true. These things are very real, although they are not material. So I prefer to use the word material and immaterial, and not virtual, because of this reason. And I don't like talking about different worlds, because it's all the same world. It's just two dimensions of the world. There is an immaterial dimension and a material dimension. All of us live in a material dimension, but also in an immaterial dimension. Everything we do has a material dimension and an immaterial dimension. And they both are very true. Like the money, it's not virtual. The money you have in your bank is not virtual. It's very real. It's not material. It's immaterial. So the pace of development has been so fast because of, you're a very educated audience, so I don't have to explain these things to you, but basically by the Moore law's effect on the development of computing power, storage power, and communication power, I/O, input-output. And these things have had an exponential trend over the years. This will not last forever. We know that in 2021, the race to the miniaturization of components is going to stop, is going to end. We are reaching the so-called end of the 2D domain. But that time onwards, the competition will not be that much on performances like it's been today. It will be on price. And things are going to become ubiquitous. Okay, these trends in processing power, in storage, and in communications are the drivers of many of the buzzwords, of the keywords that we talk about in these days. AI is nothing else than a large number of computation trillions of operations per second to do reasoning and to do machine learning. Big data is the storage, and IoT allows us to collect all data on which we base our learning and reasoning. Okay, one key point about exponential trends is that once the exponential trend passes a threshold of attention, it is too late. We could well look outside to the world and not noticing anything, but that does not imply that something is not happening. When we realize that something is happening, poof, the fact has already happened, and you had a precedent, for example. You don't notice, you cannot have a feeling, because things happen so fast because they are exponential. Now, this is a picture of a girl, a 12-year-old girl, and the interesting thing is that in the time frame that a kid gets born and goes to primary school, in that time frame, that it's a glimpse of an eye in the history, in that short time frame, more than twice the population of North America and Europe combined uses daily the operating system Android. The first Android device started 13 years ago, the very first. And in just 12 years, more than twice of the population of Europe and North America combined, uses Android on a daily basis. This is extremely fast. And this is something that has democratized the access to the internet. When DEMI started, the internet world was not even born. I remember that in 1994, when I started my SP, I have articles that said that we accounted for about 30,000 users on the internet worldwide in 1994. Okay, now we are all connected. Everybody is connected, and it's going to be far more connected. This is a survey made in Europe about the penetration in the active ages of the internet. We are 98%, 97% of the population uses the internet. In Italy, quite less, but as an average, it's about 90% across Europe. And if you ask to those people how long they stay online, the data is quite similar in all the ranges. It's about 89, 90% of the time. 90% of them say always on or multiple times a day. Fact is that we are always on, even if we don't know it. I once was on a bus in Milan, and there was an elderly person that was looking at the results of the lotto on the phone, and noting on a small booklet with a pen the data of the lotto, of the numbers of the lotto. And I asked him, how long is that you use the internet to learn the results of the lotto? And he said, no, but I don't use the internet. You see, when things disappear is when things are pervasive. You don't think about the water because you open the tap and it's there. You don't think about electricity. You don't think about the internet because it's just part of our normal daily life for many persons. This thing has happened so fast that companies have not had the time to adapt. Once the fact has emerged, it was too late. This is a cover of Forbes in 2007 saying, in November 2007, saying 1 billion customer. Can anyone catch the phone king? Yes. He has been caught. Look, this is a popular picture, you surely know. It's the election of the Pope. The interesting thing is this phone here. That is the only phone in the 2005 election. People uses the internet to hold social relationships, just take pictures, sending to friends, etc. The interesting thing is that this phone can be either a Nokia phone or a Motorola, but none of these companies exist anymore. Okay, and that is the power of the exponential trends. Then, if you look at another chart, this is quite interesting. 90%, and it's consistent, about 90% of the people that uses the internet in Europe uses the internet to do shopping. Fact is that you buy things online even if you don't know that you are doing it, because you can buy things without even noticing that you're doing it. So, social and economic relationship on the internet. The fact that the internet has had such incredible growth is not a consequence of just a matter of randomness. It was a political decision. Back in the late 80s, in the early 90s, the politicians decided that we wanted to have competition on telecommunication services in the so-called information society. At that time we called it information society. And we made asymmetric light regulations because we didn't want to have a model of development based on concrete and steel and things that weighed too much on the earth. We wanted to have a more sustainable competition. And that's why we favor a more sustainable development. And that's why we favor, with favorable rules, the development of online services. Even imposing asymmetric regulation in order to favor the emergence of competition against the telecom providers. I don't know if this happened the same in Brazil, but across the United States, Europe, Japan, we had asymmetrical rules in order to favor newcomers compared to the incumbents. So my point is, the tipping point was the introduction of the smartphones that democratized the access to the internet, and in 12 years everyone is connected, always connected, holding social and economic relationship, and also thanks to favorable regulation. Now this slide is the core of the book, really, and it's a list of concepts that is quite basic, but once you think about them all together, you can see how these are the basic ingredients on why the immaterial dimension is producing that impact on the material dimension. If you think of the material way of doing things, producing the first thing costs a lot of money, the first prototype. Reproducing it has a variable cost that is significant. If I have to produce this microphone, making the first one, trying, testing, etc., has a significant cost. And then I have to reproduce it, and that has also an important cost. Not as much as making the first one, but it still have an important cost. Then I have to store it, to archive it, I have to transfer it. Transferring requires money, requires time. The manipulation is done normally by humans. Yes, you have robots, but to a lesser extent. And the humans tend to work during work shifts on working days. Now, if you jump to the other side and you think about immaterial stuff, making it has a significantly lower cost. I am an avid player of Scrabble. You know Scrabble, the game with the letters, okay, with the weights of the letter where you have to make crosswords, okay? Mattel does a material Scrabble. They make it in plastic, in wood. I have several versions of Scrabble in plastic, wood, etc. And I have also one in stones, very beautiful. And this has significant costs. If I have to buy it, Mattel has to order the input, the input material, the plastic, the wood. Then they have to think about the logistics. They have to have people that goes to the shops and ask 4 months or 5 months in advance, how many copies do you want for Christmas? And then they have to order the inputs for the production. Then you need to ship it to the warehouse, and they need to have distributors. Now I play Scrabble, an immaterial version of Scrabble, and I played it on my phone and on my device. And you see, I play one produced by Ethermax, which is a company started by an Argentinian and a Spanish guy. The last time I looked, it was 30 people with more than 100 million in revenues, $1 million. And of course, making the Scrabble cost very little, but then making the second copy, making the third, etc., did not cost anything. They don't have to archive anything, to store anything. Transferring does not cost anything, has a zero marginal cost, and it does not require time. And the store, all things, and the support is not done by humans. And the replication is not done by humans, it's done by machines. And machines do not sleep and do not go on holidays, for holidays. So it's a completely different thing. In one side, you have Mattel. On the other hand, you have these guys from Ethermax. So if something gets completely replaced, you're going to have a tough time. Now, McLuhan says that we used to move and get around by walking, and now we walk for as a passion, for passion. But then we used to move by horse riding, and now we horse ride because of passion. And for cycling, and now we cycle because of passion. Somebody says that we used to drive to move, and now somebody says that we are going to drive for passion. So I still buy very nicely crafted Scrabble games or very nice vinyl discs, LPs. But it's just for passion. It's for a different motivation. Okay, so it's a completely different thing. It's not only related to material stuff. It's also to something that can be completely replaced. I will make you just another example that I always make. I grew up in Colombia. My father was the head of the school, of the Italian school in Bogota. And when we were there, if you wanted to buy an airplane ticket to go to Italy, you had to go to a travel agency. And the travel agency, they had the prices based on the books of Yatta. You remember those books so thick where you have all prices defined in advance, 1 year in advance, with all legs of all pieces of the transport. And the travel agent really knew what best combination were possible from Bogota to Italy, either via Caracas or Puerto Rico or whatever, and the connection, and stopping in Madrid and going to Paris or going directly. So, and then you combine the prices, and the flights were always empty because they were planned one year in advance. So you could very easily sleep in the four middle rows, in the 4 seats in the middle row. Now, this thing, this part of the commercial relationship has been dematerialized and has moved from this side to this side. And you don't have any longer the Yatta books. Prices are not defined with 1 year in advance, but they are adapted weekly or daily, sometimes even more than daily for some companies. The net result is that flights are always full, that they fly to smaller airports where the internet arrives, and the overall cost of flying has gone down, even if the price of fuel has gone up. So it's just to say, well, how you buy your ticket. You buy your ticket, you had to go to the travel agency, now you buy your ticket directly online. And the travel agency and the branch office of Alitalia in Bogota have closed. And many travel agencies have closed. Because this relationship has moved from being based on material to based on immaterial. I could go on with gazillions of examples. Now, material goods are rival and excludable. Rival means that if I have this object and I give it to Ricardo, either I have it or Ricardo has it. If Danny comes along and takes it away from us, neither Ricardo nor I have it any longer. This is obvious, I would say. This means excludable. So rival is either one has one product or the other, and excludable is that somebody can come in and making me impossible to benefit from this good. Now, this is the basis of the private property. Private goods are rival and excludable. Information is not rival, and it's not excludable. The level of excludability of the information is very limited. I'm not going to delve deeper into this, but it's a completely different thing. So basically, we don't have, in the immaterial dimension, we don't have yet, we don't have now, private property. We don't have private property. The basis of the law systems, all laws, are based on the fact that goods are rival and excludable. You don't buy a book anymore. If you buy an e-book, you are not buying anything, because the physical properties, the material properties of the physical item arrival and excludable. So I can buy a book and I can lend it to Demi. But if I buy an e-book and I lend it to Demi, I am making a crime. I'm committing a crime, a copyright violation. Okay? So there is no such thing as buying and selling. For example, I don't know if you have these green tractors in, I don't remember the name of the company, here in Brazil for farming, okay? The company argues, but even Chrysler, they argue that these tractors are not a device, are not a thing. They are a sophisticated robot where the value added is in the software. So when you buy it, you buy the atoms, but you don't buy the software. The software is licensed. And within the license, you agree, when you buy this tractor, you agree that you are going only to refer to authorized dealers in order to get spare parts or maintenance, etc., and that you cannot resell it to third parties, but you must resell it only to the company who provided it to you. You must give it back to the company provider. So you effectively ownership, the idea of ownership has changed. One very last detail, but this is very much explained in the book, is that the material dimension is disconnected. Your chairs don't talk to each other, while the immaterial dimension is connected. So you exchange information and you obtain information. And given that the information you obtain in real time, and given that storing information has zero marginal costs, this means that anything that can be computed will be computed. Any data that can be connected, and anything that can be connected will be connected. Any data that we can acquire will be acquired. And what are we going to do with it? Well, we are going to use artificial intelligence in order to extract meanings. This has some macro effects, these properties. The first one is that the traditional intermediation structure for traditional business has been replaced by an algorithmic intermediation. I don't like to call it platforms because platform conveys the idea of neutrality. I rather call them intermediators. So the Alitalia, the branch in Bogota, and the travel, Mattel, the distributor, and the shop is replaced by something that's made centrally. Then, given that transferring does not require time and it does not cost, given that everything is connected, you can have faster feedbacks. You don't have to test a product, do a focus group, come back to the factory, etc. You do testing and prototyping always in real time, and you have many tests going on, so cycles tend to accelerate. Given that you can acquire information because it's connected about the single individual, you can do a mass personalization, mass customization of information and messages. So I can give to Demi or to Ricardo exactly what they like. So the idea of mass media does not exist anymore. I mean, it's replaced by a massively personalized media. In mass media, you have targets by different media. Now the media is the single individual. Then the world gets concentrated. Everything is accessible, always, anywhere. And that opens possibility and competition. Possibilities to provide services and things to anybody, any part of the world, to get the information. If you want to know the minor detail of a certain Indian community in Bangladesh, you can know the thing now. And that's an expansion of our capability. Then, given that the cost of electronics is going down and will go down significantly, the traditional architecture where you have a single center of control is replaced by a extremely distributed pervasiveness of electronic devices. And this has an implication for surveillance. Now, if you know that there is this book, The Capitalism of Surveillance, this is the basis of the ideas. I have to go faster. I apologize, I will be 3 minutes or 4 minutes late. Since the man descended from the trees 10,000 years ago, the world has changed slowly. And we are used to live in a material dimension that has changed slowly over time. What has happened in the past 12, 13 years is that this material dimension has been enriched of an immaterial dimension that has grown significantly and has become the major user interface for interpersonal, social, and economic relationships. So we still live in the material dimension. We live also in an immaterial dimension. And this immaterial dimension for us is and will be for everybody the major user interface. I'm going to skip this. Now, we tend to think about computers, about the things you have in your knees, eventually about our mobile phones, but fact is that computers are changing, and the major new trend of interaction is by gestures or via the voice, and that thing will grow because in many situations it's the easiest way of interaction. You have lamps now that you can connect to an application and turn on the lamps, etc. But the fact is that this is an actual slide of a project of a company. The idea is that devices are going to interconnect in mesh networks. There is an initiative like Android made by Google that is called Thread. If you look to Thread Consortium, every company, electronics company, is there. And the idea is that every electronic object is going to be part of a mesh network, extending the network everywhere. And this will have microphones and speakers, etc. And that will be part of our fabric, of our homes, of our offices. We are going to be living in a computer because the computation we are doing does not sit in our computer. It's in the cloud. The data we are using is not in our computer. It's in the cloud. It's somewhere. And the way how we are going to interact with it is via gestures, via keyboard, and via voice and commands. And we are going to use services online. And the key issue the key competition asset in order to be in this part of the game, to gain access to my data, to gain access to my computation, is the fact that I can be recognized. So identity is the thing at the core of this development. Now, very, very quickly, you know very well the topic of network neutrality. In essence, network neutrality means that if you control the media of communication, the medium of communication, you cannot use that control in order to favor one thing over another, one player over another, to do discrimination. And the air does not discriminate when people talk between each other. But once you get informed, when you want to have social relationship, when you want to buy something, there are a number of other layers, the hardware, the operating system, the application. And while we'll talk about network neutrality correctly, so that those who control the network do not use their control to discriminate, we should also think about the fact that these companies that are at the top, they use their power and they base their business model in order to discriminate the messages that we can convey to each other. So this requires a second thinking. These companies are effectively monopolists or oligopolists, and they become the gatekeepers, those who allows us to access certain things. Apple has brought down an application of Facebook last week, okay? Imagine the power that they have. They can decide on top of the current law, perhaps even in coherence with the law, but even on top of the current law, they become law themselves, deciding what can be reached and what cannot be reached, for good or for bad. I'm not saying that they are misbehaving. Controlling the gateway to the dimension, therefore, is controlling the main user interface to the material dimension. We tend to think about computers as enablers, but in the last years, they have become intermediaries. They intermediate work, they intermediate holidays, they intermediate hotels, they intermediate transport, they intermediate anything. And they grab a chunk of the value. This part is not in the book. The book comes up to this slide. Okay, so the following part, and this is the last minute, is that while the Industrial Revolution brought us a traditional conflict that has developed during the 18th and 19th century between capital and labor, and we know very much about this, I call this the intermediated, because capital and labor, if you run a hotel, the capital owner of the hotel and the people who work in a hotel now are being intermediated by those who control the gateway to the information that tend to be monopolistic, because we didn't have competition, pro-competitive rules at the beginning, because we did want to foster the growth. So we have intermediaries, and there is this new conflict that is emerging, the control of information with the intermediated. What I call the info plutocrats, I have an article on this, versus capitalists and proletarians. Okay, now I'm gonna skip this and just come to the summary. Basic research dictates the development in electronics. We know how it will go for the next year. You cannot stop it. It's in the nature. Then, this fuels exponential trends and reduction in costs for processing, storage, and communication. But the properties are different. And these different properties determine some macro phenomenon. Immaterial intermediaries, algorithmic intermediaries, acceleration of events, targets of one, all the issue of the fake news, etc., concentration of the world, and pervasiveness. This leads to socio-economic effects. And the way how these socio-economic effects are developed depends on the only thing that we can change in this chart, which is our regulatory framework. And so it's important that we go to decision maker and politicians and making them comprehend what are the principles at the basis of the digital transformation of this immaterial revolution, and how they must think in order to adapt our existing frameworks to use this enormous power for good and not for bad. Thank you.
Now we are going to have our questions. Luiz Fernando Martim Casos, member of COGEI, Deni Guetico, CEO of NIC.br, and Professor of Economics of the University of São Paulo, Ricardo Abrimovai, and Itamara Lauscher, a member of CGI.br. Luiz Fernando, you have the floor. Well, I think everybody heard with lots of interest and attention the fantastic talk of our guest. Did you read his resume? I think it is very important to have an introduction of who he is, although he already showed that in his presentation. But I'm going to read a brief resume. He was born in '65. Staffo Chettarelli is an entrepreneur and Italian activist with more than 25 years of experience in computation and internet. He is coordinator of the managing committee of the Italia Digitale Agency. He was a representative between 2013 and 18, taking part of discussion of the Letter of Rights for the Internet and proposed bills on the regulation on technology, militating for a neutral network. He was the founder of i.net, one of the first access providers in Italy, and he has a graduate degree from the University of Milan, where he founded the Milan Network Research of students and professors. He was member of the high-level expert group, Artificial Intelligence, a high-level group of specialists that focus on artificial intelligence. I think our colleagues that are going to take part in the debate all have very good questions to ask. I have some, but I'm going to respect our guests, and I would ask Tamara to start with her question. Do you want to start as the warm-up? No, I prefer not to start. Okay, so let's go. Well, thank you. Thank you, CGI, for the invitation. Thanks, Stefano, for accepting the invitation. I was very impressed today with the tour that we had together with Demi to CGI. I didn't know how big it was. I am a typical example of a guy that gets home, turns on the light, and thinks electricity is natural. So when I saw what CGI is all about, I was very impressed. I'm very happy to be here together with Tanara. We don't have much time because we have 3 people here asking questions. So first I would like to make a comment about the book, and then I would like to raise some questions that I don't know if Stefano is going to have time to answer. But anyway, I had the pleasure and honor of writing the preface for the book together with Zanata. Most of you know him. And I would like to highly recommend the book, and for 2 reasons. First, because it is very good teaching material. It's quite didactic. When you want to teach your 15-year-old sibling or a young friend what this is all about, how it works, I think Stefano's book is an excellent introduction. And I think the book works as Stefano talks, by means of examples. It's completely different from my style. I'm always based on concepts, and I really admire those that can use concrete examples to expose their ideas and not rely on concepts. The book conceptually is very rich, but the examples make it very easy to understand. And second, because we are going through times in academic literature and in the press that focus on the topics that we discuss today. And it is a time of deep dystopia. That is, in 2012, I published a book that was called Beyond the Green Economy. I was talking about that during lunch. And the last chapter was very optimistic. Today, I would say almost a Franciscan optimism, to talk about what internet could mean about sustainable development, not only about its impact, how we can produce material assets and etc., but for human communication. And what happened indeed, and what we can see in literature, is delusion. And I think that Stefano's book is the antidote. I think I wasn't vaccinated against the antidote, although I'm very enthusiastic about the book. So I would like to raise 3 points that seem to be important in contemporary discussion. And all of them refer to something that Stefano mentioned in his presentation, which is control. Control. Who is in control? First, there is a political side to it. We Brazilians, but it also happened in Europe, Hungary, Poland, with the prestige of Matteo Salvini in Italy, in the Philippines, in India, and so on. We are living a phenomenon that is completely dystopic, in which the capacity of personification of messages and the capturing of this capacity in political environments converted the world somehow, and the world of politics for sure, into a completely toxic environment. And that which should be the noblest of human activities, politics, the art of deciding how we are going to live together, has become, on the opposite, something that is completely embedded of gestures and attitudes that are completely irrational. And I certainly believe you, were not trained to deal with irrationality. We were trained to deal with diversity of opinions, and to consider that. We were educated to consider opinions different from ours in terms of arguments, rationality. We are not used to dealing with irrationality, which is a characteristic of the political world today. And there is something even more important than that, which is a centerpiece of Stefano's book, which is the immaterial, as he explained, which is how immaterial interferes in the exercise of political power. This topic was surveyed since the end of the 90s with Lawrence Lassett, with the idea of Calder's law, and more recently, James Susskind in a beautiful book called Future Politics, that shows how, in a more and more expressive manner, our social capacity to discuss democratically laws and the idea of law as something that we can disrespect. You're going to be punished if you are to disrespect it, but you have the possibility of disrespecting it. As laws are incorporated to digital devices, those that design the laws are no longer in the social and political world, but rather in the digital world. And because this digital world is not decentralized, quite the opposite, it is characterized by deep concentration, then we have a major challenge for contemporary democracy, as it can be seen in the fact that when there is a circulation of autonomous cars, we will no longer have the possibility of going beyond the speed limit and get a fine. The car will not enable you to do that. James Susskind gives countless examples in the sense, and as something that could seem good is extremely dangerous because it removes us from the decision of abiding by the law and makes us far from the process of designing our own laws. So the question I would like to ask in the digital world as it is evolving today, with the degree of concentration, and especially with this degree of capturing our day-to-day, not only by the devices we use, but devices that use us and are part of us. So this immaterial dimension that is so important and more determinant of our lives, you are concentrating how regulation is dealing with that. I would like to know, how do you feel, based on your experience, that civil society is participating in the process to prevent our world to be completely captured by digital devices. And I apologize for extending myself in my comment. Tanara, you can ask your question. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for the excellent talk. I'll try to be very brief. Well, you started talking about the Moore's Law and performance doubling every year, year and a half. And that makes me think of predictions, forecast. Moorline 95 started to talk about this issue that every 18 months the number could increase by 100%, and that became a law. And today, we are saying that by 2021, it is no longer going to be true. A decade ago, they would say that the Moore Law wouldn't survive till today, and it's still on. I remember a lecture that I attended a bit more than 10 years ago talking about database. My PhD supervisor talked about that, and he would start with the 1960s with data in files, and then database management systems, and then distributed systems, geographic systems. And he ended by saying that the future was unpredictable. And today, we don't have database researchers any longer. We have data mining, big data, data analytics, fancier words, more trendy words, which are database of today, a cloud database and processing data. So what I think, and I think that was very interesting for you to bring, Professor, is that any technological development, however unpredictable it may seem, will approach the immaterial, will approach the ethics of development. So the technological issue today and technological solutions are not so difficult. Today we have many solutions for many things. The issue is how does it relate to ethics? What does it mean in terms of privacy? What the solutions imply in terms of what we can do in terms of regulation, for instance. So, Professor, if you have the time, I would like to talk about this relation of the development of technology and ethical limitations and the necessary regulations. I'm going to make some comments. And perhaps a different way of thinking some points. First of all, I think Stefano's approach of the immaterial is very consistent, coherent. I think it's very important for words to change semantics, and really the semantics virtual is not very good in this case. The word control, the root in Greek is cyber. So control is a very bad word for us in this case. But what I wanted to raise is that there is a good approach about the immaterial, very complete, and then it goes on regulation that I personally find it harder to understand. I'm afraid by putting together these two things that we are using metrics of the old world to the new world. So this dichotomy of material and immaterial is going to influence what regulation is all to be about in the future. There is a book talking about digital life, and it makes a difference between bits and atoms. If you have a frontier in a country, you can prevent some items to go in, for instance. But what do you do with bits? And as everything is turned into bits, you have an inadequacy of old control means based on matter. There is a text saying opening wine without a bottle, and it's just that. You are somewhere without borders. And still talking about words, I understand the danger of monopolies. We live among that. But perhaps this is not an issue about monopolies, but rather of power, because in fact, no one is very much concerned in trying to understand or control this trend. Ricardo talked about irrationality. There is another important Italian thinker that passed away recently, Umberto Eco, and he can be very caustic about things. And what he shows somehow, what he says somehow shows this irrationality. And I think that you have this political irrationality, but it is somehow boosted by the speed and the lack of substance that is found in the way people respond to that. So I think this is all very complicated. And perhaps it would be interesting to talk about that because we have to live with that. And still talking about laws and regulations, there is another thing that I think should be addressed, which is the following. You said that the electronic world will eventually need moral, that will no longer need moral gears because it's going to be part of the procedure. I think that we are living through times in which ethics is being replaced by law. In the good days, my grandmother said that I had to stand up to give my seat to an elderly person. Today, there is a law saying that. So it's no longer my moral obligation. I can today say, are you really 65? Show me your ID. So you are going to change something that was part of your ethical structure for something that the law tells you to do. If the law tells you to say good morning every day, the good morning will lose this value of spontaneity that is not good. And I think that may lead to complicated things. So this type of limitation is something important to address. Anyway, I thought that the talk was brilliant. And what Tanara mentioned in terms of unpredictability, in Brazil, it is even more complicated. Sorry, we have no time.
I have two questions, Stefan. Considering your experience, all your controversies to be provocative and things addressing control, ethics, and not have a good forecast imprevisibility. I was reading Le Monde, and it was said that CDS is discussing about taxation of Google, GAFO, Google, Amazon, Facebook, and Apple, which are immaterial companies. And we know that such a tribute exists maybe to overcome inequalities or maybe to represent compromise or to motivate some social behaviors. Within that complete reflection that you made, considering all the issues, I would ask to you now that expected rate, taxes, payment about the material activities, what is its final destiny? Which sort of social behavior should that motivate or maybe motivate or demotivate? What sort of situations to try to keep what you called as original order of things?
Yeah, now in all of this reply in 3 minutes. So 20 minutes for the question, 3 minutes for the reply. Uh, I cannot reply. I will give some perhaps meta answers. I was in the parliament. I was very lucky to be in the parliament, and I learned how democracy is difficult and how is fragile.
Stefano, you have 10 minutes.
I have 10 minutes. Okay. I will take my time then. I learned how difficult is democracy and how it is really fragile, and how the purpose of democracy is not efficiency. So this is part of the answer to all the three of you. We as a system, we don't tend to a solution. We tend to a compromise. And so we are not going to have any of these answers. We are going to have just approximations. And all approximations will evolve over time. All this stuff has happened in the last 12 years. And the world has changed. Can you imagine that in the next 50 years, we are not going to find ways to tackle the most pressing of these issues? The world is not going to end because of the immaterial, the dematerialization of the world. And we're going to tackle sector by sector and doing approximations. Your question about the taxes and where should taxes be directed, one thing that I learned in the parliament is that when you say that you put this tax, well, in Italy, I don't know here, once you put this tax on a certain thing and you say, well, the revenues from this tax must go to this, that never happens. Really, it never happens. They just go in the pot where to fund all the general politics of the state. So, but nevertheless, taxing is indeed an issue because we are, you know what is happening. Let's say about, now yesterday, I think, or today, well, I don't know because time really is not that important, but Apple has reached an agreement in France for 500 million euros in taxes they had not paid in the last years. You know that, I don't remember the figure, tens of billions that Apple had parked in a small island of tax that was not, or money that was not brought into the States, because otherwise it would have been taxed at the statutory rate, and they just brought this money back to the States when Mr. Trump said that he was going to give a discount on the money coming back. So there are companies that are building, based on intellectual properties revenues, they are building huge amounts of money that they park somewhere, and they negotiate tax cut in order to bring it back and distribute to shareholders, and bonuses of the managers, of course. This thing, we are going to solve it. Now there are some countries, in Europe, we are 500 million people, and it's obvious to everyone how we should deal with taxes. But there are 3 states in Europe, namely Ireland, Luxembourg, and Malta, that oppose the introduction of digital taxes, of web taxes, call it as you want. Why? Because they have based their competitiveness based on hosting companies that elude taxation. And so, as we have this way of veto power of some states, we are not solving this issue. But that will change. That will change because history goes in that direction. In Europe, we had the prohibition, a structural limitation, because of some member states that did not want to have it, for network neutrality provision. And then some states said, no, we are going to regulate network neutrality, even if the European Commission does not want us to do it. And they started the regulation in the Netherlands. And the way how the rest of Europe reacted is that they said, okay, now the dam is broken, and so let's start and regulate network neutrality. They introduced a network neutrality provision throughout all Europe. Not optimal, it's an approximation, but it's good enough. And the same is happening with taxes. Some countries are breaking the European laws, and they are starting to introduce taxes, and we are going to tax these kind of revenues. Revenues that are based mostly on zero marginal costs. It's different if you tax a car or if you tax an advertisement, because advertisement has zero marginal cost, and the cost of opportunity is 100%. I mean, if you don't sell that advertisement, you don't have revenue. If you sell it, I mean, your costs don't go up. So you can think of taxes on revenues, different levels of taxes, because you don't have the costs associated, because costs are fixed. So we can be inventive in taxation, and we are being invented. I spent too much time talking about taxes. But that is an example of how we are going to start approximating and intervening, etc. Now, about the regulation issue and this fact that somebody starts and then things evolve, think, for example, of the interesting, in my view, I was a friend of Stefano Rodotà. I worked with him a lot. And he started preaching about data protection and privacy many decades ago. And when we ended up in Europe having data protection, and now we have the GDPR. And what is happening is that even if you are not bound to GDPR because you do not operate in Europe, same kind of regulation, similar kind of regulation is pouring worldwide because of imitation. It's not identical, it's not perfect, it's an approximation, but it's starting to spore. And the same thing is going to happen. In India, they just decided that those who run an intermediary cannot be part in the game. So if you are Amazon and you have the exchange, you manage the two-sided market, having sellers and buyers, you cannot be one of the sellers. You can be the platform, the enabler, the intermediary, but you cannot be part of the game. This is an example of how you can possibly regulate some part of this, of the problems arising from this, and eventually that will happen. And that will happen in India, and it will spread elsewhere. Technology is determining the condition of determining new problems, but it's also posing the conditions of having new solutions. I am a fan of a technology called IPFS. IPFS stands for Interplanetary File System. It's a protocol suite, and if you don't know it, you should take a look at it. It's made by it's developed by a company. It's all open source, and it's developed by a company called Protocol Labs, funded by two 23, 24 years old guys that worked with Tim Berners-Lee until last year. And they are building a cryptographic overlay network on the internet so that you can become the one who controls who uses your data and for what, and where your data is stored. So they are bringing in rivalry and excludability into information. If they succeed, if they don't succeed, somebody else will succeed in 5 years. But if they succeed, in any case, it's going to change the way how we think about applications. And they will pose the foundation in order to have interoperability on internet services. And this is a matter of regulation. I will end with this. No, I have to talk about ethics. Sorry. I did this example yesterday, and I think that it somehow gets to the point. Imagine that no antitrust law exists today. No antitrust law exists today. Someone comes in, your president comes in and says, you know what, I'm going to introduce a regulation that allows me to take a company and break it apart, to force a company to be broken apart. I'm going to introduce a regulation that allows me to set the prices of that company, to tell how much market share they can have. I mean, we would not consider it a communist now. It's far worse. It's a huge power. But that has happened when a handful of people controlled the economy in the United States, the economy and politics, the robber barons. And Sherman and Brandeis, there is a very beautiful sentence, if you have the chance of reading Columbia Steel versus United States, an antitrust case, the antitrust case known as Columbia Steel versus the United States. Go and look for it. It's very beautiful, the motivations. It's heart-touching, really. And they introduced a regulation that gave this power because they said that economic power tends to become political power, and such a political power must stand in the hands of the people and not in the hands of a handful of people. It doesn't matter how respectful they are. And they did that regulation. And we are going to have similar regulations. We are going to impose interoperability. I wanted, for example, you have a problem about WhatsApp, no? Here, imagine that you don't have a single client, a single application, WhatsApp, but you have many user bases interconnected. Like you do with text messages. You cannot have a complete view of all the users because the users are fragmented. I've shown that one of the implications is that everything tends to concentrate because of the properties. But we can regulate that things must not be concentrated. It has happened in the economy. We can do it in information as well. We can put Chinese walls into, like India is proposing, into information, like we did in finance. You know that now WhatsApp is starting to limit the amount of retransmission of information. It's building frictions in the rightmost column. When you say that transferring does not require time, we could introduce frictions there. And so gain time in order for the society to allow the society to adapt. We could, for example, say that nothing can be shared more than 2 levels. And that when I share something, it appears on the other screen after 8 hours. And it's a simple regulation and would dramatically change how things are happening now. I don't have the solution. I'm not arguing that these are the right things to do. What I'm saying is that we are just starting to realize that by intervening with regulation, and we can intervene, we can determine the effects that technology has on society. Of course, ethics needs to be a part of the game. Even more now that we are moving away from an algorithmic perspective and we are going to a statistics perspective. So with AI, this is, I think, one of the things that, if I must say, what my mission now, the things I'm most interested in doing now is trying to explain people that artificial intelligence is not magic and it makes mistakes. Because the general people think that artificial intelligence can solve problems. But it does not solve problems. It creates new problems because it makes mistakes. And you must understand why it makes mistakes. I am giving classes in schools. Education plays a significant part. We are all people that we started to live before using the internet. My daughter thinks in a way that it's different from what I think. They are more acquainted to certain dynamics. They don't even think them if they post nude pictures of themselves online. They exclude it. Okay, but I never really educated them about this, but it's become part of their social community, this kind of behavior. So we need to make part of the knowledge of everybody that artificial intelligence is not perfect. It makes error by design. And so we need to take a lot of care about the people that gets wrongly, people that on top of whom decisions are wrongly taken. If you are part of a wrong decision, you must have extremely fast, extremely efficient ways of redress and correct. And that must be a core part of the design. The way how I tell this is that I tell people when I sign an account with the bank, I don't ask how much interest they are going to give me. I ask what are the conditions when I get out to close my account. So the point here is not thinking about the wonderful thing it can do, but thinking about what happens if it goes wrong, because it will go wrong. And I try to explain them that it's statistics and it's just mathematics and it's nothing, it's not science fiction. So, and once you get this, you immediately come to the fact that, oh, then we need to have an ethical view and decide what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. If you, and I conclude with this, if you have not had the chance, you can take a look in the European Commission, in the group of experts in AI, where we presented the draft version of proposed guidelines for an ethical and trustworthy AI. We started working on trusted AI, because if you cannot trust AI, you're not going to have economic success. That was the start of the discussion. We ended up saying that AI must not be trusted, but it must be trustworthy, and that trustworthiness happens only if you behave ethically. And so we enumerated a number of ethical principles. This, then we are going to propose regulations, etc. But this is how we are starting to adapt. This whole stuff happened started happening 12 years ago. In the next 12 years, we are going to see a lot of change. We are going to make mistakes. Positive regulation and negative regulation will be diffused, and we just need to start working on it, really, and learning by doing. Thank you.